everyone, welcome to the Yijing Divination Foundations course.
I'm Wang. You can simply call me Xuan.
First, thank you for waiting. I know some of you have been waiting for this course for a while. This course took time to prepare because it is not just another Yijing course about casting a hexagram, reading the judgment and line text, or discussing philosophy. What I want to show you is a more complete and practical system of Chinese I Ching divination. For thousands of years, this system has been preserved, taught, and used in the Chinese tradition to judge real-life situations. Many students around the world already know the I Ching as a text, a spiritual oracle, or a tool for reflection. And those are important. But they are not the whole map. In the Chinese tradition, the judgment and line texts do not stand alone. They grew out of a deeper image and number foundation. So before we learn how to read a full I Ching divination chart, we first need to understand the map behind the technique. That is why this first lesson does not begin with the full method. It begins with what most students never learn about the I Ching, the image and number foundation behind Chinese practical divination. Once you see this map, the later techniques will make much more sense. So let's begin lesson 1. The missing map of I Ching divination. Before we officially enter this map, I want to place the I in a larger context. Many students around the world first encounter Chinese thought through the Dao De Jing. They know the word Dao, often translated as the way. But in the Chinese tradition, if we go even closer to the root of Chinese thought, we have to talk about the Yi. Here, when I say Yi, I do not only mean the received Zhou-Yi text that we read today. I also mean an older tradition of symbols, trigrams, divination practice, images, numbers, and the observation of change. We will come back to this distinction later. For now, just remember this. The Yi did not begin as an abstract philosophy book. It came from a very practical need to observe change, read signs, and make decisions in real situations. Ancient people observed nature, seasonal cycles, celestial patterns, human affairs, and the movement of time. They also used symbols, hexagram images, and divination practice to judge timing, position, good or bad outcomes, and the direction of action. In the traditional account, the creation of the trigrams is attributed to Fuxi. Fuxi is usually placed in the legendary ancient period, about 7,000 years ago. Of course, we do not need to treat the Fuxi account as a modern archaeological conclusion, but it tells us something important. In the Chinese traditional understanding, the root of the Yi is not simply a written text. It is an ancient symbolic system, a way to use images, numbers, symbols, and change to understand heaven, earth, and human affairs. In the Yijing tradition, this is often expressed as the three powers: heaven, earth, and humanity. And the Yi tradition was never limited to the Zhou-Yi alone. Traditionally, people talked about the three Yi: Lianshan, Guicang, and Zhou-Yi. Lianshan and Guicang were not preserved in full, so we cannot fully reconstruct what they look like today. But they remind us that the Yi tradition was broader than the Zhou-Yi text most readers know. Some people even say Lianshan and Guicang may not have been limited to only 64 hexagrams. Maybe they had thousands. I'm joking, of course. But the point is serious. When we talk about the Yi, we're not talking about only one book. We're talking about a broader symbolic and divinatory tradition. Later, the received Zhou-Yi preserved the textual layer most readers know today: the hexagrams, the judgment, and the line texts. So we can put it simply: the Yi was passed down for thousands of years because it was useful. It helped the ancestors of Chinese civilization face real problems: survival, timing, uncertainty, and decision-making. The Dao De Jing came later. Laozi was not inventing Dao from nowhere. He was giving a very condensed summary of the deeper nature behind these patterns of change. So the Dao De Jing tells us something about the nature of the Dao. The I Ching shows us how change actually works in real life. That is why the Yi was never only abstract philosophy. It was practical from the beginning. And this was not unique to Chinese civilization. The ancient Romans used auspices and omens. The ancient Egyptians observed the stars, the Nile, and calendar cycles. The Maya also developed complex calendar and astronomical systems. Different civilizations used different methods, but they were facing a similar problem: how to make decisions under uncertainty. In real life, this could involve weather, livelihood, health, travel, conflict, ritual, or other major decisions. So the I Ching should not be understood only as a book of inspiration. It is a practical system of change. Later in this course, when we enter the Najia system, also known as six lines divination, this will become very clear. Najia does not treat a hexagram as only a text to be reflected on. It reads the chart through timing, position, relationship, movement, transformation, and outcome. Because the I Ching was meant to help people understand how change operates in real life. For many people, the I Ching starts in a very simple way. You pick up a translated book, cast coins, get a hexagram, then read the judgment, the changing line text, and maybe add some philosophical interpretation, psychological interpretation, or spiritual reflection. And of course, that is a real way to use the I Ching. Even in China, some people do read only the hexagram and line text when interpreting a divination. But that is not the whole picture. Let me say something that may make you feel a little better. If you read the judgment in line text and think, okay, I understand some of the words, but I still don't know how to judge this actual situation, that is not just your problem. Many Chinese readers feel the same way when they read a Zhouyi, so don't worry, you're not alone. The problem is not that you fail to understand some mysterious Eastern wisdom. The problem is that the Zhouyi itself is an extremely old, compressed, symbolic, and difficult classic. In ancient China, people who could really study the Yi deeply or use I Ching divination seriously were often trained scholars, classicists, technical specialists, or professional diviners. Even among ancient Chinese literati, someone could study the Yi for decades and still not dare to say, now I fully understand it. And if we go even further back, early Chinese divination was not like today's self-help practice, where anyone can pick up a book, throw a few coins, and read a short passage. It was closely connected with real situations: royal power, ritual offerings, war, agriculture, illness, family matters, and major decisions. Shang Dynasty Oracle Bone Divination is a very good example. Many Oracle Bone inscriptions ask about ritual offerings, war, weather, harvest, illness, and dreams. These were matters of the royal house and the state. But they did not only ask about big things. Among the Huayuanzhuang East Oracle Bone inscriptions discovered at the Ying ruins, there is one inscription that people sometimes jokingly call a 3,000-year-old sick leaf note. The inscription says, 子其义，往往学. Roughly speaking, it means that a young royal child was unwell, and they divined about his illness and whether he should still go to school. You can even imagine the joke. Maybe this young prince brought the divination shell to his teacher and said, look, even the ancestors said I don't have to go to school today. So maybe the struggle with going to school is not a modern problem at all. It may be 3,000 years old. But this example is useful. It shows that Shang royal divination was not only about war, ritual, and harvest. It could also enter illness, education, and everyday life. Some oracle bone inscriptions even ask very ordinary questions, like what to eat that day. But the point is not ancient people were superstitious. The point is this: ancient divination was not about reading one sentence in a vacuum. The people interpreting the divination knew the background, and they also had an interpretive system. So ancient divination often depended on two things. First, the actual background information. Second, the system used to interpret it. When ancient people looked at a line text or an oracle bone inscription, they did not read it as an isolated sentence. They placed it back into the question, the real situation, the social relationship, the divination context, the hexagram image, the line position, and the accumulated experience of interpretation. That is why getting a hexagram does not mean you know how to interpret it. And reading the judgment and line text does not mean you know how to judge a real-life situation. In other words, if we only have the hexagram and the text, but we do not have timing, position, relationship, movement, the 5 elements, the significator line, and the images. Many practical questions become very hard to judge. It is not that you lack intuition. You lack structure. Why does the I Ching feel difficult? In the previous slide, we talked about one important point. Getting a hexagram does not mean you know how to interpret it. And reading the judgment and the change in line text does not always tell you how to judge a real-life situation. So here, let's go one level deeper. Why is it so difficult if we only rely on the judgment and the line text? Because they are not ordinary instructions. They are very old, very compressed, and highly symbolic. More importantly, behind them, there's a whole system of image, number, and principle. In the Chinese tradition, there is a saying, before studying the I, first study divination. This does not mean the judgment and line texts are not important. Of course they are important. But if you enter the I only through these highly compressed classical texts, it can be very hard. Sometimes it is easier to begin with divination practice. You first learn how hexagram images, line positions, active lines, timing, relationships, and real-life outcomes connect with each other. Then, when you go back to the classical text, the text starts to make much more sense. So here we need to talk about 3 key layers of the I: image, number, and principle. Image means the forms, scenes, and phenomena we can observe. Heaven, earth, water, fire, wind, thunder, mountain, and lake are natural images. Parents, men and women, roads, houses, illness, and wealth are human life images. The I Ching does not begin by speaking in abstract ideas. It begins by observing the world and then turning those observations into hexagram images. This is what the Chinese tradition calls observing things and taking images. Number does not only mean numbers. It means order, stages, rhythm, timing, and points of change. For example, yin and yang, line positions, active lines, cycles, stems and branches, the 5 elements, and whether something is just beginning, growing stronger, declining, or reaching a turning point. Principle is the logic we draw from image and number. It is the deeper pattern behind the change and the reasoning that allows us to make a judgment. So, in simple terms, image is what you see. Number is where it stands in time, position, stage, and relationship. Principle is what you understand from it and how it may change next. Let me give a simple example. You see a leaf falling. That is image. It falls in autumn at a certain speed, in a certain direction, in a certain environment. That is number. From this, you understand that the season is changing, things are contracting, and what is reached fullness begins to decline. That is principle. So again, the judgment and line text are important. But without image and number, beginners can easily read them as abstract inspiration and still not know how to judge a real situation. This brings us to one of the most important lines in this lesson. Text travels more easily than technique. Text is easier to translate. Philosophy is easier to discuss. Psychological interpretation is easier to spread. Casting rituals are also easier to imitate. But a technical system is much harder to transmit. Because technique is not just a few words. It is a whole discipline. It includes how to cast, how to build the chart, how to identify the significator, how to read active lines, how to read timing, how to read relationships, and how to judge the outcome. So the problem is not that students learn the I Ching incorrectly. The problem is that the transmission was incomplete. The text was transmitted. Philosophical interpretations were transmitted. Psychological interpretations developed. Casting rituals were transmitted. But the structured technical system used in Chinese practical divination was not fully transmitted. That is why many students eventually get stuck. Not because they need more inspiration, but because they need structure. In the previous part, we already mentioned one important idea. The Yi tradition was never limited to the received Zhou Yi text. It was a broader symbolic, divinatory, and image and number tradition. So in this slide, I want to make that idea more concrete with a few examples. Today, the Yijing most readers know is the received Zhou Yi. The hexagrams, the judgment, and the line text that we read today mainly come from this transmitted textual tradition. That tradition is extremely important. But it is only one textual layer within the long development of the Yi. If we look further back, early Chinese divination and image and number thinking did not begin from a book. For example, at the Chaotou site in Yiwu, Zhejiang, dated to around 9,000 years ago, some scholars have pointed out 6-line symbols on pottery that look very similar to later yin-yang line and hexagram patterns in the Zhouyi tradition. Of course, we should not simply say that the Yijing in the later textual sense already existed 9,000 years ago. That would be too early and it would not be precise. But this kind of evidence reminds us that symbols, line patterns, numbers, image thinking, divination, and the idea of cosmic order may be much older than the received Zhouyi text. In other words, the root of the Yi was not first the book. Earlier than the book, people were already using symbols, numbers, celestial patterns, directions, ritual, and divination to understand the world. By the Shang dynasty, we see a much clearer and more mature form of divination. Oracle bone divination. The Shang people mainly used turtle shells and ox shoulder bones. For turtle shells, the common material was the turtle plastron, the flat underside of the shell. They would drill or carve grooves into the shell or bone. When they had a question, they would apply heat to those grooves, causing cracks to appear on the other side. Then the diviner would read those cracks as a response from the ancestors, spirits, or heaven. What is especially important is that the Shang people often carve the divination record directly onto the shell or bone. Some inscriptions recorded the date, the diviner, the question, the judgment, and sometimes even whether the event later came true. So oracle bone inscriptions were closely connected with divination records from the beginning. These records include questions about ritual offerings, war, weather, harvest, illness, dreams, and many very specific royal and daily matters. For example, even a question like whether a royal son should report something about jade making to his father could become a divination question. This shows that in the Shang world, divination entered many parts of life. It was not abstract speculation. It was a real decision-making system. It recorded the question, the background, the judgment, and sometimes the result. There's also an interesting modern story behind oracle bones. Before scholars recognized them as ancient inscriptions, many oracle bones had been sold as dragon bones in Chinese medicine. Before people realized that these marks were ancient writing, many pieces may already have been ground into powder and used in medicine. In 1899, Wang Yirong, a Qing official and scholar of bronze and stone inscriptions, recognized that the marks on these so-called dragon bones were not ordinary cracks or scratches. They were ancient writing. This became the key starting point for oracle bone inscriptions entering modern scholarship. Later, with the excavation and study of more oracle bones from the Ying ruins, scholars gradually confirmed that these inscriptions came from late Shang royal divination records. The study of oracle bones also helped confirm the historical status of the Shang dynasty and the Ying ruins at Anyang. So when we move from prehistoric line symbols to Shang oracle bone divination and then to the later Zhouyi textual tradition, we can see the same point more clearly. The Yi tradition was never something narrow. It was not only one book, and it was not only one reading method. We also mentioned earlier the traditional idea of the three Yi, 连山, 归藏, and 周易. I will not repeat that discussion here. The important point is simply that Chinese tradition itself remember the Yi as something broader than one single received text. Another good example is the Ma Wangdui silk manuscript of the Zhou Yi. Many I Ching versions that Western readers know today are mainly based on the received Zhou Yi text. But the Ma Wangdui silk manuscript has a different hexagram sequence from the received version, and some hexagram names, judgment texts, and line texts are also different from the version commonly used today. This shows that the early Yi text was not fixed from the very beginning in exactly the form we now know. So we should not simply treat the judgment and line text we read today as the whole Yi tradition. Earlier forms of the Yi were first connected with symbols, hexagram images, divination practice, image and number, and the observation of change. Later, these experiences were organized, compressed, and classicized into the textual layer we see today. So, if we understand the I Ching only as a wisdom book or only as a spiritual oracle, we miss a very important part of the tradition. It is not only a book for reflection, it was also a technical tradition for observing real change, judging timing, and understanding how a situation develops. The purpose of this slide is not to make you memorize Qiaotou, oracle gones, Lianshan, Guicang, or Mawangdui. The point is much simpler. The Yi tradition was never only one book and never only one reading method. This slide is a main historical map for today's lesson. You do not need to understand every detail on this map right now, and you do not need to memorize every book or every school. For this lesson, I only want you to notice a few major lines, so you can understand where the I Ching you may have learned before sits inside the larger tradition. If you are interested in the complete historical development of the I Ching and Yijing divination, both in China and in the modern world, I have also prepared a development map for this lesson. You can find it in the course folder under L1 Readings 1, I Ching Divination Development Map. That map gives you a broader view of how the I Ching developed from ancient divination, image and number traditions, classical textual interpretation, Najia and six lines divination, and later modern reception outside China. You do not need to memorize the entire map now. It is there to help you see the larger tradition behind the course. The first line is the classical Zhouyi textual tradition. This includes the hexagram statements, the line texts, and later commentarial traditions such as the 10 Wings, especially the commentary on the judgment and the commentary on the images, along with many layers of classical interpretation. This is the part many modern readers know best. You cast the hexagram, read the judgment, read the line text or changing line text, and then interpret them through philosophy, psychology, or spiritual reflection. This line is very important, but it is not the whole map. The second line is the early divination practice tradition. In ancient divination cases preserved in texts like the 左传 and 国语, we can see that people were not simply reading one sentence from the text. They were looking at hexagram images, line positions, transformed hexagrams, and the actual situation behind the question. Later, Sang Binghe, in works such as Studies on Ancient I Ching Divination Cases, also known as 周易古史考, tried to reconstruct this older image-based way of reading ancient divination cases. This line reminds us that early I Ching divination was never just text reading. It involved image, position, change, text, and real-life context working together. The third line is the later 纳甲 in six lines tradition. This is one of the most mature, structured, teachable, and reviewable systems in Chinese practical I Ching divination. It developed from earlier image and number learning, calendrical thinking, and 纳甲-related traditions. Over time, it produced a large body of practical divination texts, formulas, manuals, and case-based learning materials. On the right side of this map, you will see many of the classical and practical sources that we are continuously organizing and translating. You do not need to memorize these titles now. They include early Naja materials, image-based interpretation texts, ancient divination cases, practical casebooks, poetic formula texts, and manuals that help Chinese diviners build the technical framework. Some representative works include Fire Pearl Forest or 火珠林, Yijing Divination, Complete and Restored, or 增山谱义, the orthodox method of Yijing Divination, or 不是正宗, encompassing Yijing Divination, or 义貌, studies on ancient Yijing divination cases, or 周易古史考, and later practical collections. The important point is not the title of each book. The important point is that six lines divination did not appear from nowhere. It stands inside a long, textual, technical, and case-based tradition. This is also how Chinese students usually learn I Ching divination, through classical sources, transmitted formulas, and real divination cases. In later lessons, and especially in the advanced courses, we will return to many of these texts in much more detail. What makes Naja and six lines different is that it does not stop at asking, what does this text mean? It turns a hexagram into a structured chart of time, relationships, strength, movement, transformation, and real-life events. In other words, it transforms the hexagram from a symbolic text into a working model of the situation. The fourth line is modern Western reception. Here, I am not saying that all of our students are from the West. I am talking about the modern path through which the I Ching entered European and American intellectual, translation, and psychological traditions. One of the most important nodes in this path is Richard Wilhelm and his German translation of the I Ching. Later, Carrie F. Baines translated Wilhelm's German version into English. This became the famous Wilhelm and Baines version that many English readers know. When Wilhelm translated the I Ching, he was assisted by the Chinese scholar Lao Naixuan. Lao Naixuan came from the late Qing classical and Confucian examination tradition, so this translation is extremely important and valuable. But when it entered the Western world, it already carried certain filters: classical textual learning, Confucian interpretation, and modern Western intellectual understanding. Later, Yang interpreted the I Ching through synchronicity and modern psychology. This made the I Ching much easier for many Western readers to accept, but it also pushed the I Ching further toward the direction of psychological oracle, symbolic reflection, and spiritual self-understanding. So the point is not that Wilhelm was unimportant or that Young had no value. They were both extremely important. The point is that this transmission path had its limits. It mainly carried text, philosophy, psychology, and symbolic reflection. What was not transmitted in a systematic way was the image and number technical system behind Chinese practical I Ching divination. So this map is really telling us one thing. As the I Ching spread outside China, a lot was received. The text was received, the ritual was received, the philosophy and psychology were received, but the image and number system behind Chinese practical I Ching divination was not fully transmitted. And that missing system is exactly what this course begins to restore. After seeing the larger historical map, let's make this idea more concrete. When many people first see a hexagram, they see 6 broken or unbroken lines. That is only the surface. In Chinese divination, a hexagram is not just 6 lines. It can be read as a structure. A hexagram has an upper trigram and a lower trigram. It has inside and outside. It has 6 positions from bottom to top. A line can remain still or it can become active. When a line changes, the original hexagram leads to a transformed hexagram. So even before we enter later systems, the hexagram already contains position, direction, movement, and transformation. This changes the kind of question we ask. We are not only asking, what does this text mean? We are asking, where is the change happening? Is it inside or outside? Is it close or far? Has it just begun or has it already moved into the next stage? And very often in practical divination, we also ask, when will it happen? Later Chinese systems develop different ways to read the structure. Image-based reading focuses on the images of the hexagram, the trigrams, and the lines. Plum Blossom Numerology, known in Chinese as 梅花玉术, preserves an important part of image-based interpretation. It looks at body and use, the relationship between the inner and outer trigrams, time, number, and external omens. But in modern Chinese practical Yijing divination, the main system is 6 lines divination, known in Chinese as 六爻. It is mainly built on the 纳甲 method. In some overseas learning circles, it is also called 文王卦. This system uses the hexagram as a structured chart. It adds earthly branches, 5 elements, 6 relationships, the significator, active lines, transformation, time parameters, strength, and timing methods. Through this structure, a real-life question can be placed into a chart that can be judged, practiced, tested, and reviewed. At the same time, complete I Ching divination does not reject images or the classical text. It can also use part of the image-based methods preserved in Plum Blossom Numerology and ancient image interpretation, while the judgment and line text can serve as an additional layer of reference. So the practical structure is this. 拿甲 and 6 lines form the main framework. Image-based interpretation helps us read symbols, scenes, and appearances. The judgment and line text supplement and refine the reading. So the missing step is very concrete. It is the step between receiving a hexagram and knowing how to read it as a structured model of a real situation. Many students already know how to cast a hexagram. Many students already know how to read the judgment and line text, but they have not been shown how the hexagram becomes something you can analyze, compare, test, and review. That is what I mean by the missing map. It is not more inspiration. It is the structural method behind Chinese practical Yijing divination. Now let's make one very important distinction. Casting and interpretation are not the same thing. Casting answers one question: how do we get this hexagram? Interpretation answers a different question. After the hexagram appears, how do we judge the real situation? Yarrow stock casting, the great expansion method, 3 coins, time-based casting, number-based casting, direction-based casting, or even a sudden image, sound, movement, or thought can all become ways to generate a hexagram. These methods may look different on the surface, but they are all solving the same basic problem: how to obtain the hexagram. But the truly difficult part of divination is usually not getting a hexagram. The difficult part is knowing how to read it after it appears. That is why I always emphasize this sentence: casting is not interpretation. Many modern learners easily confuse these two things. They may think that if they know how to cast with yarrow stalks or coins and then read the judgment and changing line text, they are already learning complete I Ching divination. But we need to be clear here. What has been preserved most clearly from the yarrow stock tradition is the casting procedure. It tells you how to obtain a hexagram. But the Great Expansion method was not only a procedure for generating a hexagram. In actual divination, it would also need an interpretation system. That interpretation included the judgment and line text, but it was not limited to them. It also involved image-based reading, hexagram images, trigram images, line positions, transformations, and the real situation behind the question. The difficult part is that this older image-based interpretation was not transmitted as one complete continuous manual. Some of it can still be seen in early divination cases and later image-based traditions, but part of it was lost or became fragmented over time. This is why a book like Studies on Ancient Yijing Divination Cases or 周易古事考 is important. Shang Binghe tried to study ancient divination cases and recover the image-based logic behind them. But we should be precise. This was an important attempt to analyze and reconstruct earlier methods. It was not the same as fully restoring a complete pre-Qing divination system. For this lesson, I have also prepared an additional reading in the course folder. You can find it under L1 Readings 3, 周易故事考 Hexagram Gu Case, Historical Divination and Image-Based Interpretation. In that reading, I selected 2 real historical divination cases from the 左传. Both cases are connected with the same hexagram, hexagram Gu, but they show very different interpretive approaches. One case uses the judgment and line text together with a small amount of image-based reasoning. The other case is interpreted almost entirely through image-based reasoning. This is useful because it shows that even within the same historical text, and even when dealing with the same hexagram, later I Ching scholars could read the case through different methods. Some emphasized the text, some emphasized images, and some tried to reconstruct the deeper image-based logic behind the ancient divination record. So the judgment and line text are important, of course, but they are only one dimension of interpretation. A complete practical reading also needs image-based reading and, in the 6-line system, a structured chart method mainly built on Najafa. So casting a hexagram and reading the text is not the same as having a complete interpretation system. Here, I also want to mention one practical point. Some modern coin casting rituals place the coins inside a small turtle shell. This is not necessary. The turtle shells used in Shang oracle bone divination were not small handheld ritual objects. They were prepared, drilled, or carved, heated, and then read through the cracks. Coin casting, on the other hand, was originally done simply by shaking coins by hand. So whether you use a turtle shell or not does not decide whether the divination is accurate. What matters more is sincerity, a clear question, a stable method, and the interpretation system that comes afterward. A more complicated ritual does not automatically make a method more traditional. And there is no need to create unnecessary killing just for a modern sense of ritual. So the sentence to remember is this: casting gives the hexagram, interpretation gives the judgment. Casting opens the door, But after the door opens, you still need a system that can guide you through the structure of the case. On this slide, I divide the path of learning the I Ching into two sides. On the left is the modern overseas text reading approach. This is the approach many students already know. You cast a hexagram, read the judgment and the line texts, and then understand them through philosophy, psychology, or spiritual reflection. This approach can be meaningful. It can give people insight and help them reflect on their current situation, but it mainly stays at the level of reading and reflecting. On the right is the traditional Chinese path of entering the I through divination. This path does not stop at reading the text. It uses divination practice to enter the structure behind the text. Through image, number, line positions, movement, timing, and later systems such as the 大家 method and Plum Blossom Numerology, a hexagram is no longer just a few lines of text. It becomes a structure that can be analyzed. So the right side is not just another divination technique. It is a more complete way to understand how the I actually works. The judgment and line text are still important, but they are no longer isolated sentences. They are placed back into image, number, structure, and real-life change. This is the difference between reading the I Ching mainly as a translated text and entering the I as a living system of change. The left side can bring reflection. The right side shows you the structure behind that reflection. So the point of this slide is simple. Getting a hexagram is only the beginning. If you only read the text, you may receive inspiration. But if you want to truly understand the I, you need to enter the structure behind the hexagram. In the last slide, we saw two possible paths after a hexagram appears. One path is to read the text and reflect on it. The other path is to enter the structure and use it for practical divination. This brings us back to something we mentioned earlier. If a beginner does not yet have a strong background in the classics, enough life experience, or enough divination experience, it can be very difficult to enter the I directly through the judgment and line texts. It is not because the student is not smart, it is because these texts are highly compressed judgment language. That is why, in a Chinese tradition, there is a saying, before studying the I, first study divination. We can also say, enter the I through divination. This does not mean we should ignore the classical text, and it does not mean the judgment and line texts are not important. Quite the opposite. It means that we first use divination practice to see how a hexagram becomes a structure, and how that structure enters real-life judgment. Then, what we return is the judgment and line text. We are no longer reading isolated ancient sentences. We are reading expressions inside a larger system of change. So the sentence at the bottom of this slide is very important. The text is highly compressed. Without image and number, you are reading the user interface without understanding the underlying code. The text is like a user interface. You can see it and you can use it, but if you do not understand the image and number system behind it, it is hard to know why it says what it says, and it is hard to use it steadily in real-life judgment. This is the direction we are moving toward next, not only reading the words of the I Ching, but learning how the system behind them actually works. Now we officially enter the 大家 method. A foreign friend once asked me a very good question. Why did later Chinese diviners not continue to use the Great Expansion method as the main method for practical divination? Was it simply because yarrow stalk casting was too complicated? That explanation is not enough. The real issue is this. What many people today understand as yarrow stalk casting is not the same as the fuller Great Expansion divination method used in early China, before the Qin unified the empire in 221 BCE. Many modern learners think the Great Expansion method means using yarrow stalks to obtain a hexagram, and then reading the judgment and line text, but that is a very narrow understanding. In that earlier period, the Great Expansion method could not have been only a casting procedure, and it could not have relied only on the judgment and line text for interpretation. The judgment and line text are only the textual dimension of interpretation. More important is the image and number judgment system behind them. In other words, after a hexagram appeared, ancient diviners were not only asking, what does this sentence mean? They were also reading the hexagram images, line images, positions, transformations, and the way these image and number relationships corresponded to the actual situation. The problem is that this early image and number interpretation system was not transmitted as one complete and continuous system. So later Chinese practical divination did not move toward the Najia method simply because yarrow star casting was inconvenient. The more important reason is this. The casting procedure of the Great Expansion method was preserved relatively clearly, but the complete image and number interpretation system behind it was not preserved in the same way. This is where the Najia method becomes important. Compared with the fragmented transmission of early image-based interpretation, Najia method preserved a complete practical divination system. It is not only a way to obtain a hexagram, it is a complete method for turning a hexagram into a readable chart. That is why the Najia method continued to develop within Chinese practical divination for nearly 2,000 years. By the Ming and Qing periods, it had already become one of the most mature mainstream traditions of practical I Ching divination. This also helps us understand the position of Plum Blossom Numerology. Plum Blossom Numerology is often attributed to Shao Yong, but more accurately, it was developed later under Yong's name, drawing from Huang Jing and the tradition of observing things. It preserves part of the spirit of ancient image-based reading, but it is not a complete transmission of the early Great Expansion divination method. So, to put it simply, the Great Expansion method preserved its casting procedure most clearly. Ancient image-based reading still leaves traces, but it was not transmitted as one complete and continuous system. If you are interested, you can read my translation of Studies on Ancient Yijing Divination Cases, or 周易古史考, to get a sense of ancient Great Expansion divination. Plum Blossom Numerology preserves part of the image and number reading tradition. The Najia method preserves the most systematic and most teachable practical divination structure. So the one thing to remember from this slide is this. The Najia method changes the question from, what does this text mean, to, how is this situation structured? In the previous slide, we said that the Najia method is important because it preserved a complete practical divination structure, one that can be taught, practiced, and reviewed. In this slide, let's look more closely at what that structure actually is. In the Najia method, a hexagram is transformed into a reality model. This model is built from several dimensions: the time of the question, the original hexagram, the active lines, the transformed hexagram, and the 5 elements, 6 relationships, and earthly branches attached to each line. First, this model has time parameters. Time gives the question its current temporal position. It also has a structure of change. The original hexagram shows the current state, the transformed hexagram shows the direction of development, and the active lines show where the change begins. There is a traditional saying, 神照基于动, the divine indication lies in movement. This is a very important principle in Najia interpretation, because the active lines often reveal the mechanism of change. The model also has a relationship structure. The 5 elements and 6 relationships place the people, events, forces, support, and obstacles inside the same network of relationships. Based on this structure, we select the significator, which is the core object we need to examine in the question. Through studying the Najia method, we gradually become clearer about what kinds of questions are suitable to ask, how to identify the main and secondary tensions inside a question, and how to focus on the key point. Being able to grasp the core issue is an important part of improving accuracy in interpretation. So the Najia method is not only asking, what does this text mean? It is really tracing a series of structural questions. What structure is this situation in right now? How does the time environment affect it? How do the internal forces interact? Where does the change begin? Where might the result move next? And when might the event happen? Timing is a very common and important part of Najia practice. For example, questions such as when a pregnant woman may give birth, or when someone waiting for a job offer may receive the notice, are common types of timing questions in Najia. This is why I say the Najia method is more like a reality model. It observes a real-life situation through time, relationships, structure, and the direction of change. This is also why I Ching stream matters. Before I Ching stream, people outside China may have heard of Wen Wang Gua or seen a few scattered explanations of the Najia method. but no one had translated and organized the complete Najia method, together with its classical source text, into a systematic English learning path. The Najia method is not just a few terms or a few rules, it is a large practical divination system. To transmit it properly, you need much more than translation. You need real technical understanding, consistent terminology, a clear teaching sequence, real cases, tools, and a way to make a complex tradition simple enough to learn. And this kind of work takes years. It requires focused effort, time, labor, and resources. So when we talk about translating the Najia method, we are not only talking about translating words, we are talking about transmitting an entire system. For those who are interested, you can also read my article, I Ching Stream, the first systematic entry of classical Chinese I Ching divination into the English world. It is available on Academia, and you can also find it in the course folder under L1 Readings 2. So the sentence at the bottom of the slide is very important. Translation is not the same as transmission. Translating a Chinese sentence into English does not mean the judgment system has truly been transmitted. Real transmission is not only about translating words, it means transmitting the terminology, structure, reasoning method, case studies, tools, and review process together. In the previous slide, we talked about an important idea. Translation is not the same as transmission. Real transmission is not just translating Chinese words into English. It also means transmitting the terminology, the structure, the reasoning method, the case studies, and the way we review results. Now, in this slide, let's come back to the actual reading process. So far, we have been talking a lot about the technical structure of the Najia method. But I do not want you to misunderstand this point. Learning the Najia method does not mean the classical text is not important. A mature I Ching reading is not text versus technique. It is text anchored by technique. In other words, the text is not thrown away. The text is anchored back into structure. More precisely, the text is returned to its own foundation. The judgment and line texts were never meant to be isolated, beautiful sentences. They come from hexagram images, line images, positions, change, and real-life context. Only when we understand these foundations can the judgment and line text become more than abstract inspiration. They become language with judgment power. So we can think of a complete reading as a layered approach. The first layer is structure. We use the Najia method to place the question into a chart that can be analyzed. We look at the original hexagram, the active lines, the transform hexagram, the time parameters, the relationships, the strength of the lines, and how the people, events, and objects in the question enter the chart. When the structure is clear, the judgment will not be scattered. The second layer is image. Here we observe the trigrams, hexagram imagery, line positions, scenes, natural images, and also the images that appear in the real-life situation. Image-based reading helps us see the scene behind the text, instead of staying only on the surface meaning of the words. The third layer is the text. This is where we return to the judgment and line text. When the structure is already established and the images have been observed, the classical text is no longer an isolated ancient sentence. It can help us deepen, refine, and sometimes verify the judgment. The fourth layer is review and learning. We need real cases and real feedback. Was the judgment correct? Which part was accurate? Which part was missed? Why did we fail to grasp the key point? These are not things we learn from theory alone. They have to be trained through case review. So the core idea of this slide is simple. Establish the structure first, use image to observe, use the text to deepen the judgment, and use cases to review and learn. A mature I Ching divination reading is not just reading the text, and it is not mechanically applying a technique either. It is letting text, image, number, structure, and case results work together. Here I want to talk about a deeper goal. Earlier, we mentioned a traditional Chinese saying, before studying the I, first study divination. Many people did not enter the I first through abstract philosophy. They entered it through divination practice. But we need to be clear. Studying divination first does not mean the final goal is only divination. Divination is the entrance. Understanding change is the deeper goal. When many people begin learning I Ching divination, their first question is it accurate? Of course, this question matters. If a divination method cannot correspond to reality at all, then it has no practical value. But if someone only chases the idea that every reading must be 100% accurate, that can also lead them in the wrong direction. The real world is extremely complex. The Naja method, in essence, takes a real life situation and organizes it through several key parameters such as time, hexagram images, movement, the 5 elements, 6 relationships, earthly branches, the significator, and so on. It is a little like an ancient modeling system. It uses a limited set of parameters to model and judge real life change. The more essential the parameters are, and the more mature the judgment is, the closer the reading can come to reality. But it can never include every tiny factor in reality. Some factors may exist, but have not been systematized. Some factors may affect the result, but are very difficult to quantify. And some factors, such as the mental state during casting, whether the question is clear, and whether the intention is focused, can also affect the stability of the hexagram. So the Najab method can be very effective, but it is not a machine that can guarantee 100% accuracy. This is also a little like the ancient Chinese relationship between the square and the circle. The square can be divided, measured, and structured. The circle represents something more complete, more fluid, and harder to exhaust completely. When we use a polygon to approach a circle, the more size it has, the closer it gets to the circle. But it still never becomes exactly the circle itself. The Najia method is similar. It uses a precise image and number structure to organize complex reality into something that can be judged. But reality itself is always more complex than the model. So relying on I Ching divination alone to reach 100% accuracy is almost impossible. Even the very skilled I Ching diviner cannot guarantee that every reading will be 100% accurate. Even great figures in the Yi tradition, such as Guo Pu or Shao Yong, could not claim that they never made mistakes. This is simply objective. So if someone tells you they can guarantee 100% accuracy in every reading, you should be very cautious. Unless they truly have some extraordinary ability beyond ordinary people, the more realistic possibility is that they are exaggerating, marketing themselves, or even deceiving people. If in long-term practical divination, a practitioner can maintain a relatively high level of accuracy, for example, around 70 to 80%, that is already very rare. It is also enough to show that this system has practical value. But even this is not the final goal. The real goal is not to make us dependent on divination forever. The real goal is to gradually understand the patterns behind change through repeated casting, interpretation, and review. Many people think I Ching divination is only used to predict fortune and misfortune, or to know a fixed outcome in advance. But I Ching divination is not a sentence of fate. Its real value is that it helps us see our situation, relationship structure, timing conditions, and direction of change more clearly. If we know a possible risk in advance, of course we may be able to avoid danger and make a better choice. But some things may not be completely changeable. In that case, the meaning of divination is not escape. It is to help us face the situation with more clarity and calmness. So the value of I Ching divination is not only what will happen. It helps us understand where we stand now, where the change is moving, what we can do, what we cannot do, and what kind of attitude we should bring to the situation. In this sense, Yijing divination is more like a walking stick or a navigation system. It is not the destination. It is a tool that helps us move toward the destination. But I also want to be clear here. When I say the destination, I do not mean putting the E back into textual interpretation, classical commentary, or one later philosophical reading. The 10 wings, Confucian interpretations, and Song Ming Neo-Confucian readings all have value, but they are not the whole E. The earlier E was first of all a symbolic system. First there was yin and yang. First there were hexagram images, number, timing, position, and human observation of the changes between heaven and earth. Only later came the written text, the classics, and the commentaries. So the meaning of learning I Ching divination is not only to predict something. Its deeper value is to bring us out of a purely text reading mode and back to image, number, time, structure, and the relationship between heaven, earth, and human affairs. This brings us to another traditional saying: those who truly understand the E do not divine. Here we need to explain this carefully. This saying does not reject divination. It does not mean that people who truly understand the yi never cast a hexagram. On the contrary, many people in ancient China who deeply understood the yi also practiced divination. What this saying really emphasizes is this: divination is the entrance, knowing change is the destination. Through divination practice, a person gradually understands timing, position, advance and retreat, risk and opportunity. At a higher level, they no longer need to rely on divination for every single thing. For example, Zhu Xi. According to traditional accounts, in his later years, he faced political attacks and was in a dangerous situation. He originally planned to write a memorial to defend himself, but his students advised him not to submit it. Zhu Xi was unwilling to accept that, so he cast a hexagram and received hexagram 33, retreat, known in Chinese as Dun. Dun means withdrawal, retreat, and avoiding direct confrontation. After receiving this hexagram, Zhu Xi burned the memorial and did not submit it. This story shows that even a great Confucian scholar like Zhu Xi, when facing a real and critical situation, still used divination to judge timing, position, advance, and retreat. Xiaoyong is another example. There are many classic divination cases and anecdotes connected with him, but here I will only mention one later traditional story. It is said that, before he died, he asked not to be buried lavishly and not to place burial objects in his tomb. He also arranged for a young girl from a neighboring family to see his burial with her own eyes. Many years later, the girl's son wanted to rob his tomb. The woman told her son, "There's no need to go. I saw it myself. There was nothing inside." So his tomb was not robbed. Of course, this story has the color of later legend, but the spirit it expresses is very clear. Shaoyong was not waiting in fear for something to happen, and he was not using divination to escape change. He saw a possible future problem in advance and used a calm and simple method to dissolve it. This is knowing change. Guo Pu's story is even more extreme. Guo Pu, the author of Yi Dongling, is also regarded by later generations as an important foundational figure in feng shui and geomancy. In the traditional story, Wang Dun was preparing to rebel and asked Guo Pu to divine whether he would succeed. Guo Pu knew that Wang Dun was dangerous, but still spoke honestly. This matter will not succeed. Wang Dun was displeased and asked him, "Then, do you know your own lifespan?" Guo Pu replied, "I will die at noon today." Later, he was indeed executed by Wang Dun. What is moving about this story is not only that Guo Pu's prediction was accurate, it is that he knew he was facing death, but still spoke honestly and did not run away. This is knowing fate, not escaping fate. So these stories are not meant to tell you that studying the yi is about becoming magically accurate. Quite the opposite. What they really express is this: divination can help us see the situation, risk, timing, and direction of change more clearly. But how we walk the path is still our own decision. Zhu Xi saw that it was time to retreat, so he chose not to submit the memorial. Shaoyong saw a possible future problem, so he quietly arranged a simple way to dissolve it. Guo Pu saw a dangerous outcome, but still chose to speak honestly. You can see that these three people responded to divination in different ways. One retreated, one prepared in advance, one accepted responsibility. This shows that the yi does not lock people into a fixed outcome. It helps people see change clearly and then act with greater awareness. So when we learn the Najia method, of course we need to learn how to cast, how to build a chart, how to select the significator, how to judge movement and timing. But the deeper goal is not to let a hexagram live our life for us. The deeper goal is to gradually understand the way of change through this training. It is not only about searching for answers in words, it is about returning to symbol, nature, time, structure, and the relationship between heaven, earth, and human beings. Divination is the entrance. Knowing change is the destination. At this point, you can probably understand why Yijing stream is not just creating one course and not just translating a few classical books. What we are really trying to build is a systematic entry point into Chinese practical I Ching divination for students around the world. As we said earlier, there is no lack of serious interest in the Yijing outside China. Many overseas readers study translations, read the judgment and line text carefully, explore philosophical and psychological interpretations, and also use the Yijing for divination. All of this has value. But what has really been missing is a learning path that can organize complete I Ching divination into a system, including image, number, principle, and practical divination training. Without this kind of system, I Ching divination can easily remain at the level of text reading, personal reflection, or scattered divination techniques. It never really enters the practical divination system preserved in the Chinese tradition. In Chinese practical divination, one of the most important things is exactly this: a practical system that can be learned, practiced, tested, and reviewed. Because of language and cultural differences, students who are not native Chinese speakers need an even clearer and more organized system to enter this tradition. This is the missing bridge that Yijing Stream wants to rebuild. So, we are not building just one isolated product. We are building a source-based learning ecosystem. First, books. Books provide the source foundation. We translate and organize classical materials from the whole Chinese I Ching divination tradition, including ancient divination cases, image-based interpretation, practical classics of the Najia method, and related divination texts. This allows students to go beyond modern explanations and actually encounter the source texts so they can see how this system formed, developed, and was used inside the Chinese tradition. Second, tools. Tools lower the entry barrier. What we provide is not just a simple casting or charting tool. It is an operating system that helps students begin real practical training. It supports casting and chart construction, and it also provides basic assisted interpretation, so beginners do not get stuck at the very beginning because of the complexity of the chart structure. In the future, we will also gradually launch an AI-assisted learning system to help students understand terminology, structure, cases, and judgment logic. But here, I also want to be clear. AI can assist learning, and it can even assist interpretation, but it cannot replace our thinking, and it cannot make decisions for us. As we said earlier, the purpose of learning Yijing divination is not simply to cast hexagrams. It is to gradually learn the Yi, understand change, internalize judgment, and discern the principles behind situations through the process of casting, interpretation, and review. So the right way to use AI is to let it help us enter the system more effectively, not to let AI lead us by the nose. Only when you truly understand the system yourself can you know where AI is right and where it is wrong. The purpose of tools is not to replace learning. It is to help students enter the system more easily and gradually build their own judgment ability through practice. Third, calendar. Calendar restores the time system. In Chinese divination, time is not background information. The month, the day, the heavenly stems and earthly branches, void, strength, and weakness, all of these time parameters enter the judgment structure. They affect not only whether a line has strength in the present moment, but also when something may happen. So in the Najia method, the calendar is not just for checking dates. It is a foundation for judging strength, timing, and outcome. Fourth, cases. Cases train judgment ability. Real divination skill does not come from memorizing concepts alone. Students need to see real cases, the reasoning process, the feedback, and the result. Through review, they gradually build pattern recognition. Only by repeatedly seeing the connection between the hexagram, the judgment, and the real-world outcome can students understand how the rules actually work. And in daily life, many people may not encounter enough real divination situations, especially enough typical cases. So studying existing real cases becomes an important way to accumulate experience, understand the rules, and train judgment. True knowledge comes from practice, and case studies are one of the best forms of practice material. This is also why we created a separate case studies column. We select real cases that are representative, useful for learning, and valuable for review. We organize the full background, the reasoning process, and the final feedback, so students can have richer and more systematic learning materials. Fifth, courses. Courses organize these resources into a learning path. Books, tools, calendar, and cases, if they are only scattered everywhere, can make beginners even more confused. This is especially true when reading classical texts directly. Many people feel that there is a lot of information, but they cannot grasp the key points. Our courses, together with the learning books we write, organize these materials into a clearer and more orderly step-by-step learning path. Students can understand what to learn first, what to learn next, how to move from concepts into cases, and then from cases into review. So Yijing Stream is not simply selling a book, and it is not simply selling a course. What we are doing is putting sources, terminology, tools, calendar, cases, and course sequence into one system. This is the missing bridge we are rebuilding. In the previous slide, we talked about the overall ecosystem of Yijing Stream. In this slide, I want to talk specifically about translation. Bringing the complete ecosystem of Ching Divination to the world through English is not simply language conversion, it is knowledge engineering. A sentence can sound very smooth in English, but that does not mean the technique has truly been transmitted. Many terms in 6 lines classical text are not ordinary words. They are part of a judgment system. Behind them, there are rules, structures, and reasoning relationships. If we simply replace a Chinese term with an English word that looks close enough, students may understand the sentence but still fail to enter the system. So real translation has to preserve the system. At the very least, it has to rebuild 3 layers. First, classical logic. This means the original terminology system, the stems and branches, the 5 elements, the rule structure, and the logic of the classical texts. This is also why, when we translate the heavenly stems and earthly branches, we do not simply use pinyin. Let me give you a sense of what beginners usually have to memorize. The 10 heavenly stems are 甲、乙、丙、丁、戊、己、庚、辛、壬、癸. The 12 earthly branches are 子、丑、寅、卯、辰、巳、午、未、申、酉、戌、亥. For many Chinese learners, this is already the first obstacle. A lot of people get stuck for a while just memorizing the heavenly stems and earthly branches. For students who are not native Chinese speakers, these sounds are even more unfamiliar because they do not appear in your everyday language environment. And if we use pinyin directly, it becomes very easy to confuse them with no clear memory structure. For example, the heavenly stem Wu and the earthly branch Wu are both written as Wu in pinyin. And in Chinese, Wu can also make people think of 5 or martial. Wu, Wu, Wu. I know, at this point, you are probably already getting dizzy. So if we simply use pinyin to translate the heavenly stems and earthly branches, students can easily mix them up, and it becomes difficult for them to develop a structural sense. That is why we convert the heavenly stems into Roman numerals and the earthly branches into English letters. This preserves the order of the heavenly stems and earthly branches in a way that is consistent with E-logic, while making them easier to recognize, remember, and use across different texts. So congratulations! You have already skipped the first step that troubles many Chinese learners, memorizing the heavenly stems and earthly branches. You are welcome, haha. But seriously, this is not just randomly changing names, it is a way to make the system truly learnable, usable, and reviewable in an English learning environment. Second, reasoning chain. Students should not only know what a term means, they also need to see how that term enters the judgment process. For example, how a concept is used in the classical text, why the significator is selected in a certain way, why we look at active lines, why time parameters affect the result, and how the final conclusion is gradually reasoned out. The important thing here is not to explain each word in isolation. It is to connect terminology, rules, and cases into a chain of judgment. This is especially important because different classical texts often quote and explain each other. If the terms and key sentences are not kept consistent, students will have a hard time seeing that these texts are actually talking about the same system. So, in our translation and organization work, We try to keep key concepts, key sentences, and judgment logic consistent. This allows students to move from concepts into rules, and then from rules into real case analysis. When they read the classical text, they are not only understanding the words, they are gradually learning how ancient diviners reasoned, how they made judgments, and how they apply the hexagram to a real life question. Third, learning path. This means we are not simply piling up materials and leaving students to figure everything out by themselves. We give students a clear learning order. For students who are encountering Chinese practical I Ching divination for the first time, they can begin with my book, Yijing Divination, a practical study roadmap, and the upcoming The I Ching Divination Manual, a step-by-step guide to 6 lines divination, Wang Gua, with clear answers and real-world decisions. The purpose of these 2 books is to help students build the overall map first. They bring together the key points from classical texts, rules that are suitable for modern learning, modern case analysis, and practical operation. This way, students can first understand what this system includes, how to enter it, and which concepts are the most important. After this foundation is established, if they want to go deeper into traditional Chinese I Ching divination, they can continue with encompassing I Ching divination, or Yimao, and I Ching divination complete and restored, or Dimsan Bu Yi. Encompassing I Ching divination is especially useful for helping students build a complete framework. I Ching divination, complete and restored, contains many classical practical cases, so it helps students understand how ancient diviners selected the significator, judged movement and transformation, analyzed strength and weakness, and reach conclusions in real situations. Also, in our books and classical translations, we add a lot of background knowledge, translator's notes, and step-by-step explanations of specific technical points. Many classical passages are connected with Chinese folk customs, mythology, historical institutions, the imperial examination system, idioms, proverbs, and the broader social context of traditional China. Without these explanations, foreign readers may understand the English sentence, but still not really understand what the sentence meant in its original cultural and technical setting. So our translation is not only telling people this is how this sentence is translated into English. It is helping people understand how the Yijing system works, how ancient Chinese thinkers and diviners gradually derive these relationships, and how these rules are applied in real divination. So translating a technical system like 6 lines is not about replacing Chinese words with English words. It is about bringing a knowledge system to the world through English, a system that can be learned, compared, practiced, tested, and expanded. This is why we say translation is the path into the system, but only if it preserves the system. If someone only understands a beautiful English sentence but cannot enter the judgment system behind it, then real transmission has not yet been completed. This slide is not saying that you need to read all of these books right now, one by one. What I want you to see is this. This course is not something created out of nowhere. Behind it, there are classical texts, historical examples, case-based learning, and a learning path that takes you from foundations into deeper study. The book on the left, the roadmap, is designed for beginners. Its purpose is to help you build a map first. If you want to learn Chinese practical I Ching divination, where should you begin and where should you go next? The books on the right are the classical and practical sources that we are continuously organizing and translating. They include classics of the Najia method, image-based interpretation classics, ancient divination cases, practical divination cases, poetic formula texts, and materials that help students build the technical framework. This is also the traditional way many Chinese learners study I Ching divination, through classical texts, real cases, and repeated practical application. You do not learn this system only by memorizing concepts. You learn it by reading the sources, studying how earlier diviners reasoned through real questions, and then applying the method yourself. We will also continue translating more classical sources in the future. For beginners, reading these classical texts directly at the very beginning can be difficult, not because these books are not valuable, but because you do not yet have the framework. Without a framework, the more materials you have, the easier it is to get lost. So the role of the Foundations course is to help you build that basic map first. Once you understand the basic structure of I Ching divination, Many of these books will become much easier to read. At that point, the books, tools, cases, and courses will no longer feel like scattered pieces of information. They will become different parts of the same system. So I Ching's dream is not just creating one course. We are building an I Ching ecosystem, from the beginner's map to classical sources to case-based learning and then to deeper training. At this point, the main message of Lesson 1 should be clear. If your study of the I Ching has mainly depended on text reading, personal inspiration, or guessing the meaning of a hexagram by intuition, then the next step is to expand your map. This does not mean we reject the text, and it does not mean intuition has no value. It means we need to see that complete I Ching divination is not only the judgment and line text. The judgment and line text are valuable, but they are more like a supplement that can deepen and refine the reading. To truly enter Chinese practical I Ching divination, we need to bring image, number, principle, and practical structure back into the system. The image part can be supported by the ancient image-based interpretation tradition, and also by some theories preserved in Plum Blossom Numerology. This helps us understand the relationship between hexagram images, line images, objects, scenes, and real-life situations. The number part is mainly expressed through the structure of the Naja method. Through time, the 5 elements, 6 relationships, the significator, movement, transformation, strength, and timing, the Naja method places a real-life question into a structure that can be judged, practiced, and reviewed. So the purpose of the Foundations course is to help you build your first structural map. You do not need to read all the classical texts at the beginning, and you do not need to master every complicated rule right away. The first step is to understand what the complete I Ching divination system looks like. Which part is text, which part is image, which part is number, and which part belongs to practical judgment. This also brings us back to the traditional Chinese saying, before studying the I, first study divination. Many people did not enter the I first through abstract philosophy. They entered it through divination practice. But studying divination first does not mean the final goal is only casting hexagrams. Divination is the entrance. Understanding change is the deeper goal. And that is why we also return to another saying, those who truly understand the I do not divine. This saying does not reject divination. It means that when a person has truly understood timing, position, change, advance and retreat, risk and choice through divination practice, they no longer need to depend on divination for every single thing. So what I want you to take from this slide is simple. You have now seen the map. The next step is to learn how to read it. In Lesson 2, we will begin with the visual and numerical foundation behind this map. We will first talk about the He-Tu diagram, also known as the Yellow River diagram, and the Luo Shu diagram, also known as the Luo River writing. From there, we will move into the Pre-Heavenly 8 trigrams and the Post-Heavenly 8 trigrams. We will also introduce the basic idea of Plum Blossom Numerology and a simple time-based casting method, so you can begin to see how images, numbers, time, and hexagrams are connected. Then, from Lesson 3 to Lesson 10, we will focus mainly on the Naja method. This is the main framework behind 6 lines divination, and one of the most important methods in Chinese practical I Ching divination. Step by step, we will learn how to enter the chart, understand its structure, read time, movement, relationships, and the significator, and apply these ideas to real divination cases. There will also be a bonus lesson, so please look forward to that. Now come with me into the Foundations course, and let's learn how to read this map together.